Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Build Insight podcast. Today, we are privileged to welcome Lily from Central Vic Planning, our guide through the labyrinth of town planning. In this discussion, we'll deconstruct the fabric of town planning, learn about the significance of overlays and zones, decode industry jargon, and understand the rhythm of the town planning permit process. We'll also delve into the critical role town planners provide and uncover the strategic benefits they offer to both novices and seasoned industry professionals. Whether you're a student with a flair for urban or planning studies, a homeowner looking to build, or an industry professional embarking on your next project, this episode will equip you with the knowledge to navigate the intricacies of town planning. Welcome to episode 6 of the Build Insight podcast. Today, I'm joined by Lily from Central Vic Planning. Now, we've worked on a multitude of projects together. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you on those projects and collaborate. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to be able to demystify town planning in this episode. So I hope you're ready, Lily. Let's start off with the always the first question of who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm stoked to be here. My name's Lily. I am a town planner. I work at Central Vic Planning Consultants, and I guess we cover pretty much the whole of Victoria, but largely we focus on Central Victoria. Anywhere from, Ararat to Ballarat to Bendigo. That's me.
That's a great little introduction. I think you're underplaying it a little bit, but anyway, we'll get to that.
I'll explain exactly what we do, I guess, as we go on, probably. It's a complex.
I dare say so.
Yeah.
So, just chatting with the team at Build Insight before this, it was pretty evident that this was a topic that they really wanted to uncover so that they could learn themselves. So I'm really hopeful that, all the trade-orientated listeners right now get a lot out of it, as well as current and potential clients into the future for designers in the industry as well. What exactly is town planning?
Yeah, so I guess in a nutshell, town planning is the process of making decisions to guide future outcomes. That's what planning is. And urban planning, or town planning as it's known, is sort of focused on how we shape the communities that we live in, the cities, our towns, our whole regions, by managing development and infrastructure and services. So we've got this overall planning scheme that covers the whole state of Victoria, and the purpose of that is to have some semblance of agreement and consistency to planning across the state. And then that overarching scheme that overarching planning scheme gets modified and becomes a little bit more specific when you're looking at individual councils. And so those councils then have the chance to modify the scheme to suit their local area. So you really start to drill down. And I guess then if you're thinking about individual properties, the planning scheme is the way in which local councils sort of determine whether what you want to do on your property is right for that land. It's overarching, and there's these drilling downs and all of these schemes and clauses that help your town, your property fit in your town and in your community. So it really shapes the way Victoria looks. And planning can cover a wide variety of things, from the house that you live in to the solar panels on your roof to the kind of fence that you build as well. So it's full of tiny little details, and specific for the area. So if you live in an area that's a sandstone area or a bluestone area, the planning scheme will tell you what you can build. It really can get really very detailed, and it's constantly in a state of flux, as our idea of what a sustainable community is changes over time, and climate change. So the planning scheme is constantly changing. I actually had a look this morning because I was curious. And there were 7 amendments made to the planning scheme yesterday. It's always shifting. It's always moving.
Okay.
Really keeps.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on climate too, because that's even what I've noted. I see the constant updating occurring for flood overlays or land subject to inundation overlays. We see that modelling obviously is taking place, and that's being adopted, and that's all the time.
That's
It's
right.
amazing
Absolutely.
how the influence can be so broad when it comes to planning.
Yeah, absolutely. And the CFA are so involved as well because we have such a risk of bushfire in Victoria. And they're always looking at ways to make our homes safer and make our, communities more resilient to that pressure from the climate. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I hear resilience used a lot, that word used a lot when it comes to bushfire, particularly with what that's trying to address. And obviously, yeah, protection of life is at the forefront of everything.
Yeah, it really, really is, more and more so.
I suppose that also, in you chatting about that then, it definitely highlights how I can see how landowners have some bugbears when it comes to town planning. For them, it's probably a shock to realise that someone else gets to see what my fence looks like. What do you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be really frustrating for people, for sure. Sometimes it depends. There's sometimes a little bit of wriggle room. We can negotiate. It's not necessarily always. I like to see. So a planning application for me, when I submit it, it's the start of a conversation. It's the start of negotiations. And while things where you're just not going to have a choice, there's some things where we might be able to do little workarounds and talk to council about why something is important, and if we put together a good argument, sometimes we can shift things a little.
Yeah, I mean that. I guess that's also probably feeds onto some of the frustrations that people experience. Is like it can be subjective in some ways. Like it is. And I suppose that's its strength as much as it is its weakness, right? As you just said, it allows negotiation and discussion to begin around this and how we can find the best outcome for all stakeholders involved. But
yeah, it makes it really difficult.
I'm glad to be having this conversation, and we'll continue on. Well, I suppose I would like to know more about your role. When do you need to have a town planner involved in a project? And what advantages would you bring to the situation, or for a planning application, I should say?
Yeah, I guess, I always find we have the best success when we're involved earlier in the process, because we can guide those kind of decisions that we know will be successful, and, maybe talk people out of some of the decisions that we know won't be. Early on, so that there's less disappointment later. I think, the earlier we're engaged, the better the outcomes will be, really. Like I said, it's the start of a conversation when we put that application in, but that conversation can actually begin much earlier, right in the early planning stages of, designing your home and figuring out where you want to put it. And a planning consultant can help there. We'll have early conversations with council. They're always happy to have those. We call pre-application meetings, where we can lay out what we're thinking. It's not the final plan, but it's sort of where we're heading, and they'll give us a bit of a guide, and help us understand if it will be successful or not. We'll talk to, your architect, your building designer as well, and we can nut out issues early on. Figure out as well, sort of preempt issues from much later on when we're looking at things like meeting Res Code, which is the residential design code. And if we've got that under our belt in this early planning phase, your building permit phase much later on then becomes a bit smoother as well. That's probably my top tip, really, is engage a planner really early on.
When do you like to be, at what stage do you like to be involved? Is it sort of, you've got a concept design together, just maybe at that point where you've still got the ability to, if necessary, advise that can, I guess, basically create design changes that are going to put you in the best possible position for a successful planning application?
Exactly. That early phase, like it's hard. I'm not a building designer. I'm not an architect or building designer, so that blank piece of paper I wouldn't be able to help you there. But if I can see a concept and see some thoughts and ideas, then I can. Okay, I've got something that I can advise on and look at what your hopes and dreams are and help to guide along with the architect and along with council and. we have conversations as well with what's called the referral authorities, who might be the CFA or water authorities, and having their input early as well is good. But yeah, that concept phase it's really good to be involved from there. And not that I would prescribe anything and say, no, I don't think you should do that, it's not my place, but just point out where those ideas might not meet the planning scheme.
Yeah. Is it kosher, so to speak, to contact referral parties directly in your role, or does it have to be routed through the town planner at council?
I will often run things past the referral authority. So I've got some good friends in the know in there in various departments. Now I've developed some good relationships with those guys, so I would go straight to the source. Yeah,
that's
get
helpful.
It from the horse's mouth. Yeah, it is.
And just to go back and touch on pre-application meetings, I just want to unpack that a little bit, because the whole process of town planning, I find, is very confusing for people who generally aren't in industry, or even those in industry still find it confusing. So when's a pre-application meeting typically required? Because it's not all the time, is it?
Absolutely. Some applications are really much less complex and you wouldn't need one. And that's probably more often than not that's the case. But if you've got a particularly tricky site, if you're in a tricky zoning or heritage overlay particularly, where the design is going to be really scrutinised, and often in those cases we would have meetings with the heritage officer to sort of preempt what their thinking is for that local area. So yeah, it's not always the case that we need them, but that's something that I can advise on, I guess. As a case by case basis, I would more often than not say it's not necessary. But if you're in a tricky zone or an overlay, then it's definitely advisable.
Yeah, and it's probably, before I sort of move forward into chatting more about what those zones and overlays might be, I think a lot of people, the first question they want to ask is, how do I know if I need a town planning permit? What's the best course of action you could advise to people so that they can find out for themselves?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at purchasing a property and you're not sure what the zoning means, go straight to council first as your part of your due diligence for the property. I would say approach council at that point before you've signed anything, and talk to them about whether or not they feel that construction of a dwelling on that spot is going to be supported, if it's appropriate, if a planning permit is needed. If you already own the property, then again, you could talk to council for sure, talk to a town planner. You'd usually get that information pretty quickly probably more quickly out of a town planner than council. They can take a little while to respond, but the planning scheme is available to anyone to view. It's not the easiest thing to read. It's I guess over the last few years they've organised it a little better on the government website, so it is a bit easier to read, but it's still in council speak. It's not plain English, that's for sure. And there's so many aspects to each individual property that it can get really confusing. So you're better off talking to council or a planner.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well that we've had a few, not too often, but every now and again we get the response from basically parcel of land, and then they want to sort of transition into engaging us to start on the design work. But whilst in that process, they're sort of speaking with us and doing their due diligence, but when they reach out to council, they're met with that response of submit a planning application and we'll let you know. There is a process that councils are doing now, which is a written response request for planning advice. And it does come with a fee, but for the sake of, it varies from council to council. For the sake of approximately an average of $100, money well spent. So you can pay, find it on all council websites, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lee, but I think you can find it on all websites. It's a request for written planning advice, pay the fee, and then they have to respond in writing as to exactly if you do need planning, and then that kind of transitions into zones, overlays. I feel like I'd like you to unpack what that's all about as well, Lily, if that's okay. How do they define the character and the use of land?
Yeah, so zoning, every single individual property in Victoria is covered by a planning zone. Every single one. It's not the same in other states of Australia, and they're not all zoned, but in Victoria, every single property is zoned. There's various residential zones, industrial, commercial, farming, and the zoning is what stipulates what use is appropriate for that property according to government, state government. And the zoning is the thing that often determines whether or not you need a planning permit. And not all properties are covered by overlays, but overlays tend to be where we see how council influences the direction of use or the direction of what happens to the land. I guess there's lots of different overlays. So you might be covered. For example, a classic one that we deal with a lot, you and I, is the heritage overlay, and they generally cover, and are quite tricky, they generally cover the areas where we want to preserve the heritage of a place. That's essentially what they're for. So you're directed to design guidelines. They're quite specific. And there's another overlay called the design and development overlay, which does the same thing. Sometimes that'll determine whether or not you can build a shed or fence, what colour the front of your house will be, or what it's built of. So they're very specific controls. Those overlays lay on, quite specific things, whether you need to build the house to a certain height because of a flood overlay, for example. Does that answer that question?
It does, yeah. I mean, I'll probably dive into the weeds a little bit here and just give some scenarios. So you mentioned the last one that, if we do have a flood overlay, what does that mean for the homeowner or, the person who's developing that land? And, that usually involves having a land surveyor come out and basically establish to the Australian height data and what the existing floor level of that house, establishing, what the finished floor level of the proposed house will need to be. And then they can provide a little letter at the end and say, hey, this is what it's going to be. And they've confirmed it, and you can pass that to council and, gets a tick of approval. So there's a vast array of different things that need to be done depending on what the requirements of that particular overlay are. And again, I guess it just comes back to involving you and your expertise and being able to advise on these things as well. So
that's right, and that in particular is one of those conversations that absolutely has to happen before we submit a planning application. We need that information right up front, so you know how high you're building your house, what you need to build it on, and if you can build it at all. There have been cases in flood overlays where the water authority has deemed that it's too risky and a house can't be built. So those conversations are very important early on. Yeah.
I'm probably going to just extend on this a little bit more, because I feel as though this is where most people who are trying to research themselves get to, and then they kind of are confronted with zones, overlays, and the planning property report, which anyone could obtain if you go to what's the website? Vic Plan.
Yeah, Vic Plan is the
put the property address into the search bar, and it'll give you the ability to hit a hyperlink, establish a planning property report. You're presented with what zoning that property is in, and then if there are any overlays and what they are. The most common zone that you would see would be either probably residential, different zones. Various.
That's right. General residential zone is very common. Township zone. We do a lot of work in rural living zone, particularly out this way, a little further west from you guys. Farming zone is probably one of the trickiest ones we work with. Residential zone, we generally don't really work through sort of industrial zones that much. It does come up sometimes, commercial zones.
And now I'm going to start using language. Because I feel like town planning has a whole language of its own, and the words that are used are so different to what I would traditionally use in my day-to-day. So the word trigger is one that comes to mind. What is trigger, and how might that apply to, say, if you're building in one of these zones? And I'll say the general residential zone doesn't typically trigger a planning permit, but a farm zone will. So maybe some explanation on what that is and how that may trigger a planning permit with a farm zone.
So for example, I suppose examples are probably the easiest way of explaining. Say you've got a property in a farming zone and it's 13 acres. That size is the trigger for the planning permit, because according to the farming zone, the property, for example, because they're all a bit different, requires 40 acres to build as a minimum. So if you have 40 acres, sure, go ahead and build, as long as there's no overlays saying otherwise. If you've got a smaller lot than 40 acres, then that triggers the need for a planning permit.
Yep. And
Does
trigger
that make sense?
is just a means of saying that it requires, right? It's
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly it. Yeah. I like the word trigger. It's a funny one. Yeah.
Yes.
But it basically that's all it means. Yeah, it's all it means.
I'm going to keep picking on language stuff throughout this conversation, so word in advance.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem with planning in Victoria. Particularly, I don't know about other states actually, but it's why I have a job. It's why I work in this industry, because I've learned how to interpret planning speak into English and back again. It is difficult. Yeah. It's another language. Yeah.
We say the same thing about plans. It's an entire language of its own that we can interpret and then convey, hopefully, in simple terms.
Exactly.
So you can, the overlay will. So it still requires an assessment, and within a zone and within the overlays, there's decision guidelines. And is that what you address when you do trigger one of these items? Or you
That's
can trigger
right.
multiple as well? Yeah.
Just to backtrack, sometimes you do need a planning permit under the general residential zone. If your property is, sometimes it's often under 300 square metres in size, then that would trigger just a planning permit just for that, just so they can make sure that it would fit. Council could make sure it would fit, really, and not, you have to deal with overlooking issues and all of that sort of stuff. Sorry, I forgot what the question was.
It's raised another one for me, and I just want to try and really break this down as much as we can.
Decision guidelines.
The commonality of it all. And I suppose one of the ones that, if it does trigger residential, is we're going to be addressing something that's known as Clause 54 and Clause 55.
Yes.
They're two things that are going to come up, and again, are very common. Maybe just expand on that as well.
Sure, yes. So, it is complex. Clause 54 is for construction of a single dwelling on a lot, and they really specify in great detail what you can achieve. So there are things in Clause 54 and 55, which is about 2 dwellings on a lot, and then there's Clause 56, which is for subdivisions. They drill down into the real detail, because generally we're looking at smaller lots. So like I say, we're looking at things like, are your windows overlooking the existing windows on a neighbouring property? Are your setbacks the same as your neighbouring properties? It's about how to make this house fit in this place appropriately. So it's very, very detailed. How big is your garden? How much sort of permeable materials have you got on the land? So it's very detailed when you start looking at that, and that's just one of the decision guidelines, aspects of the decision guidelines. So
I'm trying to create this cake that we're layering at the moment. So very tough. We've got our planning scheme, and then under that, every single bit of land in Victoria has a zone, and then if those zones trigger a planning permit, then they might address one of those 3 options there, which then has its own decision or responses that we must attend to. We haven't got to overlays yet, but those points you've just mentioned there, like their site and compliance aspects or res code, they address all different things. Like they can address the amenities of your neighbours, making sure they're not being overshadowed or overlooked by you and what you're proposing to develop. Permeability, assist in not overburdening the stormwater drainage system. All these things definitely have the right merit. Like they're trying to create development that is, I suppose, just improving the livelihood and place that we live. Right. That's what it's trying to do.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah, in a nutshell, it's about making it a nicer place to live for everyone, for sure.
And then we get to overlays. So I'm not going to, this is more vast. If we have that, we've got our zones, and then under that we have the array of overlays that can expand from that. So what are some of the common ones that you would see, and how do people usually address that? Are there other consultants that need to be involved as well?
Yeah, often. I think probably the most common overlay, the one I enjoy the most probably, is the bushfire management overlay, because, I just enjoy getting out into nature, assessing sites for bushfire risk. So that is probably my, probably when I work on the most, and involve conversations with a bushfire consultant like myself to work out where on the property the house is best placed. Because often there's a bit of conflict with access roads, access to water, the requirement for a septic system, working out, making sure that we don't lose too many trees. We need to minimise the number of trees that we lose to create what's called your defendable space that sits around the building to keep you safe. What the BAL rating, the construction rating, will be on a house. That's quite detailed and complex, and it's a great little jigsaw puzzle that I love working on. I really do enjoy it. So that's probably the key one for me. And then often we will have, now I'm trying to think, I've lost my train of thought.
Well, I do have a question on that.
Okay.
Is that, it sounds like there's the planning aspect for your involvement, but when it comes to bushfire management overlay, bushfire management statements that get prepared, or bushfire management plans,
yes,
maybe a little bit earlier in the piece to involve you, especially on larger acreage properties?
That can be a really, really helpful move. Sometimes not necessary. Sometimes it's quite straightforward. If you're in a township covered by bushfire overlay, it's pretty much more simple. But if you're on a rural living property where it's a bit more complex and there's a lot of trees and you need a septic system to fit in there somewhere in a shed in your house, getting in there early it's really helpful. It's really helpful, and I often find that people are really grateful for that sort of support early on. From a bushfire consultant, just to be clear about what's possible. Often people want a house in the middle of the forest, and that's a beautiful thing, but they want a driveway that's 400 meters long, and that's probably not going to be acceptable to the CFA in particular. That puts their lives at risk, and so we have to draw everything back. So it's often a real negotiation to get the house in a nice spot that works for everybody. It's a real, it's a really nice plan.
This is probably a personal question, but and you might be able to help me out with this one. But septic systems you touched on, and when is it apparent that you might need a land capability assessment? Or not?
Okay, that's a really good question.
What is a land capability assessment?
So another very common overlay that sits under the planning scheme is the environmental significance overlay. Generally, we call it the ESO1. It's the one where the property might fall into the category of being vulnerable to any waste water that is released from it. I guess that's how I put it in a nutshell. Maybe it's the property is within a water supply catchment. It's close to a river, etc. So council and the water authority and environmental health department want to see a land capability assessment. And what that document does is, it's produced by a specialist who works with soils and understands the nature of flow. It details precisely what septic system you need for your property, for your house, because it can depend, the type of system you have will depend on distance to waterways, the number of bedrooms you've got, the slope of the land, how close you are to those waterways, etc. So and then later on you would need a permit for your septic system anyway. So that land capability assessment informs. They're good to have up front early on as well, because sometimes they can be quite huge. You need an effluent field generally for a septic system, and that can, if you've got a big house, if you've got 5 bedrooms, you probably need a very, very large area that's probably double the size of the house that you're building. So you need, often. that needs to be worked out ahead of time to make sure it fits. So we've got a couple of lovely land capability assessors that we work with that we'll often try together just to nut it all out, work it all out together. We kind of triangulate a little bit sometimes. So I'll be looking at trees and fire risk, and they'll be looking at water flow and soil, and then we sort of like, okay, this is where the house has to be. This is it. This is the spot.
Driving past, it is 2 or 3 of you in the paddock. As one's looking up and one's scratching the ground and just thinking, what the hell am I looking at?
It's pretty funny. Yeah, and then when we've got environmental consultants, so I also work with some amazing vegetation and environmental consultants who, their role is to protect. Often we have also... So I think we just cut out there. I'm not sure if you picked that up.
I've still got you, Lily. You're okay. Yes.
My internet. Okay. So we work a lot with land management consultants who are required when we've got a vegetation protection overlay or some other overlay to protect the land. And they will come in and make sure that we're not planning on lopping any beautiful vegetation that we want to preserve. So sometimes there's the 3 of us out there or 4 of us out there looking at trees, the soil, bushfire, all together. And sometimes the building designer or architect will come out as well, so we can all understand what's going on. Yeah, it can be quite complicated.
It just comes back to the same thing that we raise all the time, and that's just having your team together as early as possible, working together, because it just provides the best possible outcome every time without fail. And you're not left, right. I guess, with your pants down, so to speak, for lack of a better term.
Let's cue the disclaimer. It's Anthony here from Build Insight, and I need to let you know that myself and the Build Insight team are in no way, shape or form qualified to give you personal or specific business advice. We strongly encourage you seek out the use of professionals for products or when you are making personal or business decisions. Everything discussed during the Build Insight podcast is our own and the guest opinion and personal experience and is of a general nature only.